program. We can go on to the next page. Next slide, Abby. So the objectives for this meeting will be to present the proposed actors and roles for the program and ensure that we all have a shared understanding of those actors and roles, to outline the key features of the proposed assurance framework for the program, and then obviously to facilitate an engagement, foster some discussion on those proposals, and really get your feedback on if you think they might work, if we've missed anything, and so on. We've got some directed questions. Okay, next slide. So the agenda for the meeting, first we'll start off with some updates on the program development and a recap from the kickoff call and the survey that we shared on that kickoff call. Then Abby will present on the proposed actors and roles in the Scope 3 program, and then facilitate a discussion on those actors and roles, followed by Shay will present on the assurance framework, proposed assurance framework, and again, facilitate a discussion on that proposal, and then we'll finish with some next steps. So just to recap some of the housekeeping, obviously we're meeting on MS Teams. We have two time options to accommodate the different time zones. In terms of substitutes, we have had a couple of requests already. If you can't make a meeting, please just check in with us first so that we know that who's coming to these meetings. We've shared background materials. You should have had those come into your inbox last week for this meeting. Let us know if you didn't receive those materials, and we'll follow up with the slides from this meeting after this meeting. During the call, I always like to have see people's faces. So if you're able to have your video on, please do that. But obviously keep yourself muted unless you're obviously asking a question. And then in terms of questions, during the presentation, if you have a question, particularly clarifying question, please put it in the chat and we'll do our best to answer in real time. And if not, please save those questions for the discussion sections. Code of conduct, you all have that code of conduct. Really just to reiterate, to respect the perspectives and contributions of other members, come informed, ready to contribute to the discussion, and being as open and honest as possible, notwithstanding the antitrust notice on the next slide, and the NDA that we've signed as well. We're operating under the Chatham House rule. There's a link to the rule there, but really the rule is about not revealing the identity or affiliation of any speakers or participants in terms of what was said during the meeting by whom. And then final one, which is really important, is to please keep in mind our vision, which is to unlock immediate and large-scale investment in supply chain climate action. That's what we're trying to do here. Next slide. Just a reminder, we have some policies that we're adhering to. The terms of reference are linked there. We're almost done on all the NDAs. I think there's just 2 or 3 outstanding NDAs to be signed. So thank you everybody who's managed to complete those. They're always interesting to try and get those signed. We have an antitrust notice on the next slide, which we'll touch on. In terms of resources, that's our email, our team email. Discourse, we're nearly set up on Discourse. I apologize, it's taken a little while. We've been distracted with some other work as well, but we should have Discourse, a Discourse community set up soon. And then in terms of events, Shay Wales will be attending the North American Carbon World next week. So she'll be at the Verra booth and around at that conference. So say hi and introduce yourself. And then just a request, for New York Climate Week, we may have a meeting at New York Climate Week, and so this is just an open request. If anybody has any space that we might be able to use or knows of any space that we might be able to use during New York Climate Week, please let us know. Next slide. Yeah, and then just to touch on the antitrust notice here. So we're operating under antitrust law, of course, and really just to touch on, yeah, members of this group will agree that we'll refrain from discussing any confidential information that's likely to affect a commercial strategy or information that may be considered competitively sensitive. And then everybody has a responsibility to object to a topic or behavior if they believe that it's anti-competitive. And we will obviously honor any of those kind of concerns and align with these safeguards. But please read that antitrust notice in your own time as well. Okay, and I will now hand over to Luca to give a bit of a recap of the survey from the kickoff meeting.
Yes, thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I wanted to give you a quick overview of the outcomes from, well, the kickoff meeting, but also the survey we sent you after the meeting. So regarding the first couple of questions that were about the stage gate approach for the launch of the program, in the end, we decided about Verra will release first version 1 of the program in Q4 of 2025, then followed by version 2. Anyway, please keep in mind that in building the version 1 of the program, we'll keep into consideration also the feature that will be then released in version 2. And this approach will enable to have first to release the program as soon as possible and have a first impact and an actionable starting point. But it will also take into account the feedback that we received. It will start defining some of the key principles that will then be used in the version 2 in order to enable the scalability of the program. The other important point was regarding the decision-making criteria. On this, we have revised them, and you can find them here, but also in the request for proposal. And the objective is to give more clarity and add more detail, especially to the feasibility to implement the program and the alignment with climate goals. I see, Emma, that you have your raised hands. I don't know if you want to give now your question.
Yeah, very quickly, it says here the first release is scheduled for Q4 2025. That's in quite some time. Is that correct? Or is it 2024 that you're aiming for? Just for my expectation management.
Yeah, I can take that one if you like.
Yeah.
So release of the first version of the program Q4 2025 is right. We'll be building and then piloting this program over the next year. We need to go through 2 public consultations as well, and then board approval. So yeah, that's the timeline.
Thanks.
Okay, and going forward, I ask Abby to go to the next slide. Yeah, thanks. So the other part was regarding the principle for the Scope 3 standard program. Here you can find them listed, and we took, let's say, inspiration and consideration also of the other programs and frameworks in the landscape. And we're aware also, based on the feedback, of some tension regarding or about some of the principle and some of the definition used. But anyway, we thought and we reasoned that these principles are fit for the purpose, and so they will be adopted. Anyway, we will release documentation with more, let's say, more reasoning about this decision in this course once this is set up. So you can go also through this to see all the different questions and outcomes. Okay, moving forward, I will give you a couple of updates regarding the program. Maybe you already be aware, but we released the request for proposal for the methodology adaptation and the piloting process. A quick note regarding the timeline. So we invite you to submit your proposal before by the end of April 26, 2024. And after that time, we will start interviewing the most promising one and also answering any clarifying question that you may have. And the idea is to have final candidates by May. We also be grateful if you share this with your network, so we may have more opportunity and more proposal to analyze. The second point is regarding the methodology adaptation guidance. We are finalizing the draft of these initial documents, and it should be available next week. It will be released via the already published RFP. So please be aware and the lookout for this. Okay, if there are no questions on this point, I leave the floor to Abby.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Luca. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll provide a brief overview of what we are proposing for the actors and roles for the Scope 3 program. Just noting that the slides are building from the brief that was circulated last week to help tee up the conversation. And we'll focus the majority of our time really on Objective 2 here, which is a discussion to gather your feedback on the practical application of these actors. Okay, so to frame up the conversation, you've seen the slide before. The proposed actors and roles that we'll focus on for today are those that would primarily engage with version 1.0. So that's the box to the left of the slide with the red square. And this involves the quantifying and certifying of intervention units. But naturally, the right to report aspect is inherently linked to version 1. So we'll touch on how we foresee these actors engaging with version 2. But just want to note that much of our thinking on the design of version 2 is still very much in process. Okay, so we'll start going through 3 actors that you're probably familiar with if you've engaged with the voluntary carbon market, but their role being slightly different in the context of Scope 3. So starting at the top with the standard setting body, which as an example would be Verra, right? And the primary function of this actor is to develop and maintain the Scope 3 standard, approve methodologies, approve registration and verification requests, issue intervention units. Their role in version 1 and version 2 is the same in that they would conduct a completeness check for basic compliance with the requirements. And then just moving vertically down to the next row, the validation and verification body. So Shay is really going to speak to this actor and their role in much greater detail when we get to the assurance piece of the presentation. But the main point here is that the VVB acts as a independent third-party auditor to essentially ensure the integrity and credibility of the intervention design and its outcomes. As for the registry, so we spoke about this a bit during our kickoff call, but in a nutshell, there are really 2 intentions with the Scope 3 registry. So first, to track and record certified emissions reductions and removals from the interventions, and then second, to track the entities that have demonstrated the right to report those Scope 3 intervention units. And there would be different layers of transparency within the registry, meaning the intervention proponent would have access to different documents and information than the public, which would be limited. Okay, so now just a brief overview of the actors that are a bit more nuanced in the context of the Scope 3 program. So starting at the top, the intervention proponent, which really for all intents and purposes is analogous to the project proponent in the VCS. It's really the actor that takes on the control and responsibility of the intervention. So they are the primary point of contact with Verra and the VVB. They're responsible for preparing and submitting various forms of documentation, like the intervention description, and for validation and the monitoring report for verification. In version 2, the right to report, this actor would review and approve right to report applications. noting too that these applications are also going to be reviewed by a third party, but the intervention proponent would act essentially as a gatekeeper to help mitigate the risk of double counting. And then with the support of the registry's functionality, the intervention proponent could potentially secure return on investment from the selling or transferring the Scope 3 intervention units to corporates that demonstrate the right to report. And also, the intervention proponent could potentially claim Scope 3 intervention units if it demonstrates that feasible supply chain link, right? And then, so moving down to the Scope 1 intervention owner. So this would be the actor that is implementing the intervention activities, such as a farmer planting a cover crop or a factory installing, say, an electric boiler. And by definition, the intervention influences their Scope 1 emissions. And our thinking is that by default, they would have the ownership of the reductions and removals from the intervention. And through potentially a contractual agreement, these outcomes could then be transferred to the intervention proponent. Noting also that there is a scenario where the Scope 1 intervention owner can also be the intervention proponent. And in that case, there would be no need to transfer ownership via contract, right? And just want to note here that really like the intention of this approach is that the Scope 1 intervention owner has a right and a say in the intervention development and the resulting benefits. But one of the points of discussion that we'll get to here in a moment is whether or not this actor's rights and interests could be protected with various safeguards instead of being the default owner of the outcomes. So we'll explore that in a bit when we get to the discussion part. Okay, and then to move on to the entities with the right to report. So this actor really fits squarely within version 2, and that they are typically envisioned to be corporates that would be interested in reporting the Scope 3 intervention units against an abatement target. So any corporate interested in reporting these outcomes would have to submit a right to report application demonstrating a feasible supply chain connection to the impacted product that is associated with the intervention. Okay, so now on to the good stuff. So we're going to talk to this diagram and how it builds on the actors we're proposing. So I think just first a bit of like a lay of the land. So the dark blue boxes refer to actors that would be within the Scope 3 program. The red line in the center indicates what actors and roles would take part in version 1, which is below the line, and then version 2 above the line. The yellow shapes loosely represent a flow of resources. So investment in the intervention, in this case, from the intervention proponent, and then potentially a return on investment through the transfer or sale of the Scope 3 intervention units. And then the red boxes referred to various actions or roles that would take place between the actors, such as requesting the right to report. And then the optional service providers, so that's in the light blue box, these could be contracted experts that assist with the development and management of the intervention on behalf of the intervention proponent. So to help illustrate, so an example would be, I'm just going to move to this diagram with an example. So say the intervention proponent develops a fertilizer reduction intervention with wheat farmers. The wheat farmers would act as a Scope 1 intervention owner, and through a contractual agreement, transfer the ownership of the intervention.
Abby.
Yeah.
I think we might have lost the screen share. Has it disappeared for others, or is it just me?
I can still
No?
see it.
Okay, perfect, great. Continue on. It's just my end.
Just you, Candace. Good thing you've seen it before. So yeah, so saying that the Scope 1 intervention owner would transfer the ownership of these intervention and the intervention units. In this case, we're using 100, a nice clean number, to the intervention proponent for whatever compensation or benefit is agreed upon. And then the intervention proponent, perhaps most likely with the help of technical experts, completes and submits all the required documentation for validation and verification, resulting in those 100 intervention units, which would be issued on the registry. And then in this example, we have 3 companies, so 2 that sit in the same supply chain tier, and then 1 that sits in a different supply chain tier that are interested in reporting these outcomes. So they submit a right to report application that demonstrates that supply chain link to the wheat that was impacted by the intervention. And then once approved by the intervention proponent and reviewed by a third party, these scope 3 intervention units are issued to the companies for annual reporting. So for simple math, 50 to each company within supply chain tier 2, and then 100 to the company in supply chain tier 1. And then through this transfer, the intervention proponent outside of the registry could receive compensation for implementing and managing the intervention. So with that overview, which I hope was helpful to illustrate our proposed approach, we can go on to the next slide and begin discussion to really gather your feedback. So we have a few questions here that we hope you can think on. I'm not going to read them out loud, but have a look. Feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, provide comments in the chat. And then also just want to note that if we don't get to hear from everyone today or later on this week, you're like, oh, I have a thought, we're going to follow up with a survey to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to provide feedback. Yep, so with that, let's hear what y'all are thinking. Yep, Meinrad?
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Just one quick question about, I don't know if you can bring back the slide on about the definition of the different actors. Just with respect, yes. So with respect to intervention proponent versus intervention owner, I mean, there may be a role here missing in between. I don't know if it deserves a specific definition, but you may often find a case of 2 intervention proponents, one being typically a corporation, another one being maybe a project developer, right? So providing the service to the corporation, and the project developer is the one interacting on a regular basis with Verra, and corporation is the one investing. In such case, I would think that assuming that impact units are not to the intervention owner, but indeed to the intervention proponent in this case, something that would define that the corporation investing in this case would be the one receiving impact units, and not the entity interacting with Verra on a regular basis. So I don't know if it deserves a third role or not, or whether you leave this entirely to a contractual arrangement between the two.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. And something that another scheme that we drew up was very similar to that. So exactly, I think the intervention proponent could be like a project developer with a contractual agreement with the corporate entity that's investing in the intervention, or vice versa. So I think it's more, we're defining what is the role of the intervention proponent and the responsibility, but who that entity ends up being could be a corporate, could be a project developer. Yeah. Does that help answer your question?
But with respect to ownership, let's call it that way, of impact units in this case. I mean, impact units are delivered to the corporation, or delivered as per contractual arrangements between the two.
Yeah. Yep. So the ownership, and feel free, team, to chime in if you have a better idea of how we're thinking about ownership, those with the voluntary carbon market background. But the intention, I think, is that the ownership would remain with the intervention proponent. But then the return on investment from the sale of those scope 3 intervention units would be handled through a contractual agreement with the intervention proponent and the corporate.
Yeah, and just to add in, from a VCS background perspective, or just kind of in line with the definition of intervention proponent, the key message there is that the intervention proponent has the right to control and operate the intervention, and it's taking on responsibility. So if you're a corporate and you can demonstrate through the list of evidence requirements that we're going to lay out in the standard that you meet those requirements, you can be the intervention proponent. And then you can hire a project developer to kind of run the show, prepare your documents, but they can't be the intervention proponent unless they can demonstrate they have the right to control and operate the intervention and are taking on that responsibility. So I think kind of that very specific definition kind of weeds out some of the, I don't know, like the different options, and they can figure out a lot of that complexity between the two of them through contractual agreements. We often see, like in VCS, for example, that you would have a project developer supporting the project proponent, but they wouldn't be the project proponent. They would be listed as another entity on the VCS PD, for example.
Right, but then here it's a different context precisely with developing a new scheme, right? And for value chains. For the corporates, typically we'll want to be, we really want to own these impact units coming out of the intervention because it's directly related to its value chain and the products that they sell. But typically they will not necessarily want to interact on a regular basis with Verra. They will leave this to another part. So I mean, that's why I raised the question. It may be worth differentiating these roles there.
And Myra, do you foresee like a unique role being created for like a corporate intervention unit owner, or would that be can you tell me more about what you would propose?
Just maybe, well, actually, I don't know, because I haven't really, I'm seeing this now, and so, but I'm just, you know, I think you can probably, there's a need for sort of a third role is, yeah, between, so yeah, so that basically the entity that receives the impact units in an account is not necessarily the entity that has an account and deals with Verra on a regular basis. I mean, I don't know, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So meaning that there will be accounts. One account is for the administration of the intervention, and another account is to receive impact units, if you see what I mean.
Also, just to add in really quickly, the project developer, the person that's dealing with Verra, dealing with PMD on a day-to-day process, talking about reviews, resubmitting documents, that person can have a signed communication agreement on file and be the person Verra speaks to and the VVB deals with, and be different from the intervention proponent. So just to say that the intervention proponent doesn't have to be the day-to-day person that Verra or the VVB is interacting with. John, I think I cut you off, maybe.
Yeah, I know you pretty much covered it, Shay. Yeah, so the intervention proponent is more about the entity that takes responsibility and ownership, as you said, Meinrad, of the units, but there's no reason why those kind of administrative functions can't be contracted out to, you know, a specialist or a consultant, and that happens all the time in the voluntary carbon market, and that's kind of the model that we're trying to follow there. So I think your question, Meinrad, is more about ownership and having control of the units, and so I think companies will have to figure out, you know, whether they want to have a contractual arrangement with with an organization that fulfills all the administrative duties of the intervention proponent, or whether they want to be the intervention proponent but outsource those tasks to another specialist or a consultant.
Great, thanks. Nathan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, and this may be preliminary. Maybe this is a right to report thing, but what actor will be responsible for sort of providing the data about these interventions to those who are responsible for sort of identifying the background emissions factor to truly prevent double counting, right? Because otherwise, a company that wasn't participating would still pick up the benefit of the intervention in that background. We haven't gotten to that part yet.
Kind of broke up a little bit, but I think I want to make sure I heard this right. So you're asking, like, what actor would provide the intervention data specifically related to the default emission factor? Is that right? I think is that what you all heard too?
Can you guys hear me still? Sorry, I'm in rural Georgia.
Yeah, you're coming through a little bit more clear now.
Okay, I apologize. That's basically it, Abby, except it's not only provide the participating companies that data, but to provide non-participating companies with information of how they need to adjust their own emissions factors to take account of the fact that removals have been sold, right, and claimed and should not be included in that background emissions factor.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So my initial thinking is that, to answer the first part of your question, that default emission factor would be within the realm of the like corporate entity that is leading the intervention, that's interested in reducing their value chain emissions. So that's my initial thought. And then the other component of how that Scope 3 intervention unit is integrated into an entity with a right to reports emission factor or inventory, that somewhat would sit outside of the Scope 3 program, and in the sense that our intention is to develop integration guidance, so support on how an entity with a right to report would approach that, but it wouldn't necessarily be a requirement within the program.
And maybe, Nate, are you also asking about like how do we enforce that others adjust their emission factors that aren't part of the program? In which case, I think it's it's a bit challenging for us because that's outside of our control. But we're hoping through the transparency of our registry, at least we're providing the information that could assist with doing that.
Yeah, Candice, that I think was my question, and so I think the answer is the registry. I agree with you. You guys can't be held accountable for that, but I think the Scope 3 program will be held accountable for providing that information so that others can do it. And then of course it's up to them to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's our aim, is to provide the information and make it possible, but because we can't check everyone's inventories, we can't enforce it.
Great.
Yeah,
Alan?
maybe-
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Maybe to continue on this question, I scraped the Verra website for all of the GPS polygon files, and I overlapped them with a program that we have within Rabobank that's used for supply chain decarbonization. And I think that's already a great starting point. If that would be public, I will put a few screenshots on the different shapes of polygons that are uploaded on the Verra registry to show how important it is to have at least visual overlap analysis as a starting point, maybe to answer the question that came from rural Georgia just now, because I think it's an excellent question. I'll put them in the chat to give you a bit of a context from what we could already do, even if we can't look into all of the supply chains, but at least have the registry play a role in this.
Great. Yeah, that's fantastic, Emma. Thanks. Alan?
Sure, thank you. I've probably got three things actually. The first thing was an observation on the proponent question, because when I first read it, to me, when I'm looking at the transport sector, the proponent for a lot of this sort of activity is actually the end customer. So in terms of language and a typical person or organization getting involved to drive it, it tends to be the end customer wants an emission reduction. They tend to go to their transport service providers and say, I want an emission reduction, and are fairly neutral about how that is brought about. So it sounds like I might be coming at it in a similar way to, I understood Meinrad's question at the start. So given that two of us have come across that, I think you might want to think a little bit about how that's worded. Having heard what was expressed in the presentation, I now think what you mean is not so much a pull, but someone who's pushing a solution into the market. So in the transport sector, more like the producer of a low emission fuel who's wanting to selling it in, which is not what came across to me at all to start with. In terms of the actors, again, thinking from a transport sector perspective, there can be quite a lot of nested activities. So an end customer buying from a logistics service provider who are buying a transport service maybe from a modal specialist, who is probably then needing to produce a low emission transport service based on buying a low emission fuel. And I'm wondering how the actors that you've got here handle this nested situation, whether you're expecting actually each one of those interactions to be handled separately, or whether actually there's a way to nest them into a single, I don't know, transaction or flow, because again, that wasn't clear to me. And then in relation to the question from Nathan about residual emission factors, this is actually something that we've already addressed for the transport sector in our market-based mechanism transport guidance, putting guidance in there as to what the scope 1 actor should be doing in order to report an adjusted emission factor onto its clients that aren't part of the intervention. It's definitely clear that needs to be in there. And I think if it's not in there, in the guidance, in the registry, etc., then that's the sort of thing that's going to cause other people looking in from the outside to say, you know, we just can't take this on because this hasn't been taken into account.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm just gonna. So what I heard first is like, and I just want to make sure I'm also understanding Meinrad's point and your point, Alan, is that there's an intention or an idea of an additional actor that potentially is the holder or the owner of the intervention units. That's not. There's the intervention proponent, which is the owner and responsible for the intervention. But then this concept of how does the corporate fit into that, and like, are they a separate holder of the intervention units? I mean, that's not fully thought through, but it just kind of to understand the point that you're making.
I think the point I was trying to get across is that this can be brought about by a push or a pull or some combination of the two, and so you've got those sort of forces at both ends. And just the use of the word proponent, just from a language point of view, doesn't clarify which of those is covered.
Yeah. Great point. Thanks.
Yeah, just to jump in, Alan, we took proponent from the VCS program role of project proponent, and that was intentional to try and align with that role within the VCS program. But I totally understand your point now that it could come from the project level, or it could come from the corporate level, or probably some mix of the two, right? So it's more of a language concern, but the intention of the role is not to.
Sure. I'm coming at this as someone who's not an expert in VCS, so it's a fresh pair of eyes. So.
Great. This is good.
But actually, isn't it? I mean, this is a new standard, right? I mean, so it doesn't have to be to mirror exactly what's happening in the carbon market. We are looking into adapting it, right? So there will be adaptation, obviously. I mean, in my view.
That's correct. Yeah. I think we're just trying to keep some terminology as similar as possible for the sake of projects that want to switch between programs and some of our common documents and legal documents. But yes, no, generally it's a new program. It's a separate program.
And then, your question about nested emissions, I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone else on the Scope 3 team had a thought about Alan's question regarding and maybe it's John, did you have a thought? If not, I was gonna try and clarify, but.
Yeah, I think so. So I think, Alan, you're talking a little bit about kind of like the supply chain, or like the system within which this intervention sits, and how that kind of interacts within the supply chain. Maybe I'll pause to clarify.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
One of the problems with logistics is that you have these nested contracts, so that you can have 3 or 4 layers of contract, and the end customer, who ultimately wants it in their scope 3 is probably relying on a logistics service provider, and it's probably in their scope 3 because they're probably relying on a carrier in a particular mode who actually is the scope 1 owner. And so you end up passing this potentially through the chain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that would Abby, could we go back to the diagram, please?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Couple of slides. Yeah. So the focus obviously of this program is on the intervention. So it's a single, we take primary data from the project and certify that data. And then I think, Alan, you're talking about how do you take those certified interventions, those units, and then how do they kind of propagate through the supply chain? Now that would be the top half of this diagram. And you would have to, each entity would have to demonstrate their right to report those units based on that supply chain connection. So we're trying to separate out those two pieces of the program of like the bottom part is fully focused on the intervention and certifying that reduction has occurred. And then the top half is about who can actually make a claim to that intervention based on that supply chain connection. I could see that would get potentially pretty complex, and that would be part of the role of the intervention proponent to figure out in a very complex system, or even in a system where there isn't full traceability, okay, which of these actors do we actually believe is in this supply chain? And that's why version 2 is going to take longer to develop, because we've got to figure out some rules about how do we define that. So,
but your answer there actually would take me back to the idea of the push and the pull, because in the transport sector, the push proponent, which I think is what you were originally had in mind, would be, say, a fuel provider. They will just provide it to the person who uses the fuel in all probability, but I've got more questions on that later, and I don't want to monopolize too much. And then the allocation, as you put it, of who's got the right to report is probably more actually with the end customer who's initiated the contract chain. So what we've done is confirmed to me that we definitely need both those roles defined in there, right. I think.
Yeah, and I think it could happen either way through contracts, right? Like I imagine there's a paper trail that you could track that investment from the investor, from the end user, all the way through to the project. Yeah,
Great.
thanks, Alan.
Yeah, thank you. Who's up next? Krista. Yeah, go for it.
The question I had was, obviously you guys have learned and been able to draw a lot from the VCS work that you've done for so long in building this. I'm curious to hear, just at a broader level, are there one or two things you could share that you, as you were developing this aspect, the scope 3 now, that you said, oh, this is a time when we should diverge because of all of our experience with VCS. This is something that should be different.
That's a great question. I think I'm going to look at my team that has more experience with the voluntary carbon market in Verra, Candace or Shay, and John as well. Like, I mean, I have a few thoughts that come to mind, especially with the entity of the right to report. That's certainly like a new actor that's specific to the scope 3 program. And the scope 3 or the scope 1 intervention owner as well, I think is inspired by free and informed prior consent. I think I got that wrong, but the intention to safeguard the actors that are developing or implementing these interventions. So it's also a take from the VCS and inspired by that. But great question, Shay. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just building on the scope 3 or scope 1 intervention owner that, like Abby just said, doesn't exist in VCS and is something kind of we're playing around with. And I think that was one of the discussion questions on if it's providing value being a separate entity or maybe just complicating things more. But I think what VCS does well is the program defines these entities with very specific legal language, and it's so specific that it actually offers a lot of flexibility. So while the definitions maybe aren't always the easiest to read, it's providing flexibility for, I think, use in our program fairly well, and then us to be able to kind of like take those roles and then fit them into the design of the Scope 3 program, which will be fairly different than BCS. So it's like plugging in concepts from BCS, but I don't think it's the same program whatsoever. So, and as Abby also mentioned, the entity with the right to report and the whole new role for the intervention proponent, kind of approving right to report applications is a totally new thing that we're building off BCS.
Great, thanks. Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. I think we danced around this a little bit with some of the earlier questions, but if you could go back to the role slide, I just wanted to be absolutely clear on one thing with the intervention proponent there. It seemed as though you were agreeing that the intervention proponent could also be the intervention owner. Given that they are sort of a role-based definition, there's nothing that excludes the intervention proponent from also being the owner. Is that accurate for case one?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. That's the intention. Mm-hmm.
It is also true in that case that the intervention proponent could be a entity with right to report. Obviously, it can't be both the intervention owner and an entity with the right to report, because then it's not really a Scope 3 now, is it? But is the reverse also true, that the intervention proponent can be a company who is investing within their value chain, and they would have the right to report those IUs that would be generated from that project?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
You're on it. Yeah.
Okay, so it works both
so long
ways.
as they can demonstrate that link through the application for the right to report. Yep.
Now, bringing that into the next slide with phase one, is the expectation that all intervention proponents in stage one will be entities with right to report, given that you won't be extending this out to other organizations as right to report entities, unless they have reporting value for the IU generation. Is that the initial expectation for version one?
Not necessarily. I think we're developing the intervention proponent role where it could be fulfilled by an entity that perhaps has no interest in reporting those outcomes. You could see an entity that sits outside of the value chain, like a financial institution that would be, as an example, interested in acting as a project proponent and potentially gleaning that return on investment through the sale or transfer of those units to actors that do demonstrate the right to report. So it's I think we're developing the program, so it really could be it's a role. It could be a corporate that's seeking to reduce emissions within the value chain and report those, or it could be an entity that sits outside and is not necessarily looking to report those reductions or removals.
Okay, great, thanks. And my last part on this one, and you may not be up to this point because it is mostly around version 2. In this schematic itself, there's an indication that there's 100 IUs generated. The tier 1 can claim 100, and multiple organizations in the tier 2 can claim some combination up to 100. Is the expectation that each of the different tiers are able to claim up to 100 IUs generated, or is it only for a single level? Is this an and or an or between the tier 1 and tier 2 boxes, essentially?
Yeah, great question. Yes, so it would be an or between the two, in the sense that the magic or the complication, whatever, of Scope 3 is this idea of like nested emissions and the opportunity to support this idea of co-claiming. So the IU could be claimed in supply chain tier 1, supply chain tier 2, up to the amount that has been verified, right? So does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Well, I just want to be clear. So the expectation is everybody that is within this value chain can claim those reductions in their Scope 3.
If they're reporting the emission, yes. I think if you're reporting that emission in your baseline, and then you can claim the impact if there's a reduction.
Okay, and then it's upon the intervention proponent to provide sufficient justification that each of those entities that are reporting it are indeed part of the value chain through some reasonable levels of assurance.
Yeah, that is part of the role, yeah, of the intervention proponent is like a first, maybe I mean, not necessarily a first party, but like the first gatekeeper, like evaluating that application to see if there is a demonstrated feasible supply chain link. But then the added layer, which Shay will get into in a minute, is like that would also be assured by a third party as well.
Okay, great. I don't want to hold up other questions, but I did have one other one. Is this bidirectional? Can this affect both upstream as well as downstream scope 3s?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think we're designing it to be used as such. Yeah.
So for instance, if a chemical company were to install point source capture for carbon coming off their furnace, the oil company who produced the natural gas could purchase those IUs to apply against their scope 3.
Yes, so long as they can demonstrate that feasible supply chain link.
It's a bad example.
What's that?
Theory. It's a bad example, but in theory, like if it was maybe take an example of a fertilizer company that produced a more efficient fertilizer, and then that fertilizer is actually used by the farmer on the field, then the fertilizer company, yes, could then make that claim to the use of that fertilizer because the fertilizer company reports that in its downstream scope 3 emissions.
Right. I was purposely trying to reverse it to look at an upstream example. I think that the obviousness of the downstream is pretty solid. I was thinking about it upstream as well, but I move the conversation to some other. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I'm just looking at time. I know that we have to move along in order to spend some time on assurance. So maybe we'll just take one last question from Melissa. I know you're third, but you haven't had a chance to speak. So
thanks. Just kind of a thought as we were kind of following this thread of the different actors that I guess Meinrad and Alan kind of got started on. I had a thought occurred to me that maybe there's kind of another actor in here, which is like a project sponsor. I don't know what the right word would be for it, but somebody who, could very well be the same as the intervention proponent or the scope 1 intervention owner or an entity with a right to report, or like you said, like a financial institution that's wanting to invest. But kind of differentiating then a little bit between somebody who is like supporting the project versus actually kind of like making the project happen, like an intervention proponent. And then because with right to report entities, we would have some that, presumably would be like very much supportive of the project and playing more of that like lowercase p proponent role. But then you could also have some that are very passive in all of this. And so they, because if they can demonstrate a link with the supply chain, they should be able to report it, but maybe they're not involved at all in the project. So just kind of throwing that thought into the mix.
Yeah, that's a great bit of feedback. And I feel like you're almost like part of the room of our conversations last week, because we circled around this multiple times and like came up with different ideas of intervention unit holder, or what does it look like to potentially have this other entity that is the investor or the sponsor, right? And so, yeah, really helpful to hear that feedback and thinking on this idea, and something I think we'll continue to have a look at. Yeah. Any other questions? I think I would say throw in the chat, and we're also going to send out a survey to make sure we hear everyone's voice and feedback. And we'll move on to the next piece of the presentation. Shay, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Abby. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking to our proposed intervention assurance design. Mostly I'll go over the problem statement when it comes to assurance in the Scope 3 program, important terms and concepts for us to all be aligned on, the overall kind of high-level assurance design, and then we'll have a lot of time, I think 30 minutes or maybe a little bit more, to discuss the proposal and open questions with you all. So really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to start us off with some basics about how the Scope 3 program is going to operate, and then we'll kind of add on these new assurance and Scope 3 concepts as we go through this presentation. So like VCS projects, registered Scope 3 interventions implement activities that alter the conditions identified in the baseline scenario, and greenhouse gas ERRs that are achieved by an intervention are quantified in accordance with an applied methodology, just like what happens in the VCS program. Each intervention unit, which we're going to call IUs, represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide that's reduced or removed by the intervention, and the volume of impacted product that's associated with that reduction or removal. And we'll be speaking to rules on that in upcoming sessions with you all. And then all information related to the intervention and units are going to be stored on the Verra registry, and that information, or each intervention unit, will come with attributes, including an assurance level attribute. So it'll be really clear what level of assurance was kind of used in generating that unit. So the registry will be the storehouse for all the information, and we're going to try to make it as transparent as possible. Next slide. And I'm just going to keep going. I see there's some chats, but I don't think they're related to me. Okay, so we tried to keep like 3 main things in mind when we were designing the assurance framework for the Scope 3 program. First, we understood that we needed to leverage existing institutional knowledge and market familiarity with the VCS program requirements. This program needed to address the fact that it may not be financially or logistically feasible for interventions to verify every year to a reasonable level of assurance, like what happens in the VCS program. And we needed to balance program integrity with practicality, keeping in mind that currently there is no assurance requirements for interventions. And then next slide. So I just wanted to give some background on kind of how ISO describes assurance and what that word even means while we go through this presentation. So according to ISO, the level of assurance refers to the degree of confidence in a greenhouse gas statement. And ISO defines 3 levels of assurance. We have limited, reasonable, and absolute. Absolute assurance means there's no assurance risk, and this is basically unattainable and definitely not cost beneficial. Then we have reasonable assurance, which describes verification activities that are designed to provide a high but not absolute level of assurance on historical data and information, and that's the level of assurance that the VCS program uses. And then we also have limited assurance, which describes verification activities that are designed to provide a reduced level of assurance on historical data and information. I think that's also not related to me. So according to ISO, there is really no level of assurance below limited assurance, and ISO is defining assurance within the context of verification. So that's the main takeaway here. Next slide. But while ISO doesn't define a level of assurance below limited, we're arguing that by being registered in the Scope 3 program and complying with intervention design and ERR quantification rules, the program offers standardization and a higher degree of confidence in a greenhouse gas statement that's made by an intervention registered in our program compared to an intervention that's not registered under any other greenhouse gas program or that's operating independently. So we're kind of saying that actually there is some level of assurance above no assurance, and our program is providing the framework and the standardization to provide that higher degree of confidence and higher assurance. So with that in mind, following validation and verification of the first year of ex post ERRs, we're proposing the option of offering a self-attestation prior to unit approval. So in this option, interventions still need to prepare a monitoring report, but instead of having it verified by a VBB, they would complete a self-attestation form that would confirm all information is true, and then they could submit the request to Verra, have it approved by Verra, and then they could be issued intervention units without having that monitoring report information verified by a third party, which the benefit of that would be drastically reducing time and cost for interventions. And then next slide. So I just wanted to take a second to just compare the different assurance processes available within the Scope 3 program. So we've discussed or are going to discuss validation, verification, and self-attestation. So these are all processes that occur outside of Verra, so Verra is not doing any of these processes. And validation is performed by a approved accredited third party, VVB. It happens prior to registration or issuance period renewal. And the nitty-gritty of it is that it determines if an intervention meets the program rules and is likely to achieve the estimated annual greenhouse gas ERRs. And validation is really kind of an investigation and an assessment of the information presented in the intervention description. And then verification is also performed by an approved third-party VVB. In our program, we're offering 2 levels of assurance for verification: limited level assurance or reasonable level assurance. It happens prior to unit approval, so you can't, or you, after a verification and you submit your request to Verra, that could result in units being approved and units being issued to the intervention proponent. And a verification confirms that the intervention was implemented in line with the intervention description, which was validated by that VVB earlier in the validation stage, and that outcomes are quantified in line with Scope 3 program rules. And then lastly, we have the self-attestation assurance option, which we've talked a little bit about, and this is performed by a first party. It could be an intervention proponent or a project developer, supporter type entity role. And it happens prior to unit approval, similar to verification, but it doesn't involve any sort of verification. And this declares that the intervention was implemented in line with the intervention description, and that outcomes are quantified in line with the program rules, and that all information is true. So basically saying you're not lying, and we realize that this information isn't being verified, so you're testing that everything you're saying in your documents is true. I'm going to have us move on to the next slide. And this is kind of an illustration of the assurance design on the VCS program that I made. And the intent here is I'll walk you through this, how to read it, and then I'll walk you through the Scope 3 program intervention design, and then we can hopefully fairly clearly see the difference between how VCS works and the assurance options within that program and how different it'll be in the Scope 3 program. So to start us off, we'll look at the key in the right-hand corner. So the square boxes with green, orange, or yellow are representing entities that are performing a role. And so the green boxes represent roles performed by the project proponent, orange, the VVB, yellow, Verra, and then the yellow stars are representing VCUs or units. In the next slide, they'll represent intervention units. And then you read this figure left to right and bottom to top. So from left to right, we're seeing a timeline of accrediting period. So it starts with registration, and then each box that has a Y in it is representing 1 year within accrediting period. And then from bottom to top, this is representing steps in the process within VCS in this case. So when it comes to registration, for example, first the project proponent prepares documents, then the VVB does their assessment, which would be a validation or verification to a reasonable level of assurance. Then the project proponent submits the request to Verra, let's say registration request. Verra then does our review, we approve the request, and then the project gets registered. So that's kind of the flow. So I'm gonna just kind of go over some high level points when it comes to assurance in the VCS program. So under VCS, the project crediting period for non-AFLU projects is either 7 years, twice renewable for a total of 21 years, or 10 years fixed. And then for AFLU projects, the crediting period is anywhere between 20 and 100 years, but then VCS has baseline reassessment requirements that kind of fill a lot of the gaps left by having a long crediting period. So basically, the takeaway here is in VCS, there's a lot of variability in the length of the crediting period. And in our program, we're going to really standardize that and reduce the length and not have as much variability. And I'll go into that in the next slide. Also in VCS, it's important to mention that there's no other assurance option besides reasonable level assurance. So there's no limited level assurance option and there's no self-attestation option. If we look at path 1, or like it kind of looks like a metro map, what I just walked you through, the pathway for registration, the crediting period either starts with a registration or joint registration verification, meaning a validation must be conducted to a reasonable level of assurance for a project to be registered under the VCS program or to renew its crediting period. In the Scope 3 program, we're going to basically, or we're proposing requiring that this first step be actually a joint registration verification, whereas in the VCS program, folks have the option of doing a standalone registration followed by verification, or a joint registration and verification all at one time. And then in path 2, this is kind of representing the steps that happen preceding verification approval in the VCS program. And basically in the VCS program, monitoring period information is verified to a reasonable level of assurance, and then credits can be approved and issued. So I think the major takeaway here is that in the VCS program, monitoring periods are usually many years, like probably at least 3 to 6 years on average in my experience. And in the Scope 3 program, we would expect that monitoring periods are only a year due to annual reporting requirements. So then let's turn over to the Scope 3 assurance design. And you can see there's some differences here. So this figure operates the same way as the other one, so I won't reintroduce it to you, but I'm going to highlight some of the key features of the assurance design for the Scope 3 program. The first one is that we are proposing a 5-year issuance period, which is similar to the VCS crediting period, but it's only 5 years, and it's very standardized. And we're doing this because by standardizing it and making it 5 years, which is fairly frequent, this means that interventions will reassess their baseline and additionality routinely, and that's going to mitigate the risk of overestimation or mismatches between kind of the intervention and inventory emissions factors. So we're trying to address that type of risk here. Also, as I mentioned before, a joint validation verification is going to occur at the start of each issuance period. And this is like a very firm touch and look into the intervention just to make sure everything's in order. A VVB is going to do a reasonable level assurance validation verification at this point. And there'll be a lot of kind of in-depth assessment of what's going on in terms of the intervention's design, quantification, and alignment with standard requirements. And then also as part of this joint registration verification, that first year of greenhouse gas ERRs are also going to be verified to a reasonable level of assurance, which is going to provide a real-world test of the greenhouse gas estimates that were presented in the intervention description. So we're sort of like heavy hand on assessment of intervention design, on estimated impact, and then on real impact at the start of every crediting period. And then we're offering, because we understand that there are these annual reporting requirements and it takes a long time to get projects through a VVB's assessment and then through our review. We want to provide flexibility so that, you know, folks can report annually on their impacts. So in years 2 through 5, we are not requiring a specific assurance level. So basically in these years, interventions continue to monitor their activity, but they may choose to verify outcomes either to a reasonable level of assurance or to a limited level of assurance, or they may choose to do a self-attestation. So if you're following the kind of metro line under unit approval, the intervention proponent prepares their documents and then they can choose to do a verification and then submit that and all the other information to Verra, or they can just do a self-attestation and not have that monitoring period information verified by a VVB, and then still get issued and approved units, get units approved and then issue units. So that's the flexibility that we're providing in years 2 through 5. And that's to kind of, and that's the intent there is like, we're providing a lot of rigor and checks in the registration in year 1, and then, you know, flexibility to kind of address real world realities in years 2 through 5. Okay, and then we also have the random year verification that we're proposing to implement as a quality control measure, which incentivizes reasonable level assurance verifications, and then also incentivizes the submission of accurate information, because we're acknowledging with that self-attestation, we have less insight into what's happening on the ground, so to speak. And we want to, you know, make sure folks are being accurate with the information that they're submitting to us. So basically this would work where a random year verification would only be triggered if years 2 through 5 were not verified to a reasonable level of assurance. So it would only be triggered in the case of a limited level of verification or self-attestation. And Verra would just choose 1 year to be verified to a reasonable level of assurance as part of that random year verification. So if an intervention just chose to do a self-attestation for years 2 through 5, the random year verification would be triggered. Verra would randomly select a year, let's say year 4. A VVB would verify year 4, and we would expect that to match up fairly well with what was reported in that self-attestation as far as ERRs. Okay, and then the last kind of key feature I wanted to highlight is on the next slide, Abby. And this is the overissuance buffer pool that we are proposing. So basically, to address overissuance risk due to a lower level of assurance, we're proposing that interventions basically need to withhold a certain percentage of the intervention or of the greenhouse gas ERRs and interventions D units achieved by the intervention. So if you verified a monitoring period to a reasonable level of assurance, you wouldn't have to withhold any intervention units. But if you verified a period to a limited level of assurance, so lower than reasonable, we're proposing 10% with being withheld and deposited into a specific intervention, a specific overissuance buffer to kind of compensate for any incorrect information or overissuance. And then if you just did a self-attestation and were issued units, there would be an automatic 15% taken off the top and deposited into this overissuance buffer. We have a bunch of questions on this in the next slide, so we're definitely not set on these percentages. They're just sort of numbers that we thought would get the ball rolling and we could get your feedback on. So the intent of this is just acknowledging that lower level of assurance and acknowledging that, or we're expecting that interventions might take advantage of the self-attestation option with information not being verified. So having this overissuance buffer is just safeguarding against overissuance. Okay. Last slide, please, Abby. And these are just the questions that we prepared for you guys. So I just want to open the floor. I'm happy to answer any kind of, I know I presented a lot of information there, so I'm happy to provide clarification, or also really interested to hear your thoughts on this design or responses to these questions. I'll just give you like 30 seconds, and then if not, we can go through. Okay, hi Nate, go ahead.
Hey, first of all, really appreciate that. And I had some trouble like following the slides, so apologies if this was answered in the slides. But so the year one, first of all, just to make sure I understand, every project under this Scope 3 program is required to do a validation and verification at the same time, effectively after 1 year of activity, to sort of verify ex post the emissions reductions. Is that right?
Right, yeah. At the start of each issuing period, you would either validate or revalidate and verify the first 365 days of activity.
So then,
yeah.
I think my concern there is, so many of these interventions are going to be either agroforestry or silvopasture or afforestation, establishing trees. And obviously, like verifying the carbon impact of planting trees a year after you've planted them will be both not cost effective, highly misleading. Whatever number you get from that will not be a good predictor of what the number in future years might be. So as I read this, I think you guys have in your mind like the typical agricultural intervention where it's sort of predicted and predictable on an annual level. Have you thought about maybe establishing two pathways for those two different kinds of interventions? Or how else have you thought maybe about accommodating that issue?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective to have like a different option for forestry projects. I definitely know what you're saying, because in VCS, the estimates kind of mean nothing in terms of well, not mean nothing, but just aren't maybe as accurate if we're talking about a solar project, right? Because trees grow and conditions on the ground are different than something that we know with more certainty. A solar farm is producing this much energy per day, per year. So I think we can definitely look into or discuss kind of another option for forestry projects. We had considered that there might be options when it comes to start date. So if you start planting, maybe you wait, I don't know, a couple of years, 5 years, until you register your project, and then your trees are larger, are growing more. But I think this is, something we can think more about. I don't know if Candace or John, you had anything else to add? I know we had talked about this.
No, the only thing I would add maybe, Nate, is if you have any ideas for what you think would be reasonable, we're open to proposals. All of this is tentative and still in the conceptual stage. And the purpose of this group is to welcome feedback, and we don't anticipate where we start and propose will be where we end in the end. So it's just an initial brush.
Okay, thank you. I'll put some thought to that. And I know Melissa Gallant from PNC is on the call. Melissa, if you wouldn't mind, I might reach out to you to pick your brain on that as well. And then Shay, I just had one other question, which was, on the one hand, I understand the idea of like the intervention buffer pool to sort of guard against inflation of self-attestation. But on the other hand, because we're not actually transferring the ownership of a unit to the company that's making the claim, right? We're just giving them information which they're including in their reports after they fill out the attestation, or sorry, they provide assurance that they have the right to report. I mean, wouldn't it be easier just to say, look, you're going to get numbers, and some of them are going to be fully verified, and some of them are going to be estimates. And it's sort of on you to update your reports according to the way those numbers evolve over time. And therefore, if you would like to, deliberately underreport them to avoid a situation where you had to revise your numbers downward, that's totally up to you. But we as a standard and a registry, it just, to me, it's hard to figure out what the right percentage would be, because we know so little about how this thing is going to go. And I'm not sure it's as necessary as it is in the offset space, where you're talking about an actual tangible, item that now has to be replaced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we have had discussions about what deductions mean for scope 3 units, and if we want to go with like pure accuracy, or if we want to bring in components of conservativeness. And I hear what you're saying. I think we can have more conversations about that.
Shay, there's a couple questions in the chat that we thought maybe we could answer live. Sure. So there's one from Jonathan about, does reporting have to be done annually? Those companies that I have spoken to suggest cash flow for projects like this is critical. Can companies submit for unit approval on a quarterly or monthly basis?
Yeah, so there would be no reason you couldn't do that. I think monthly would be probably a lot of work, but there is no like limit in terms of monitoring period, or I guess maximum is 5 years or 4 years, since we have that joint registration verification. But yeah, if you want to submit a monitoring report every 6 months and fill out a self-attestation every 6 months, that's totally fine.
Yeah, I think with the additional option of self-assurance, you may get more frequent submissions of material, because the burden of proof is slightly lower. So if they were using software, they'd be able to put that in, just like you put in, for the low carbon fuel standards, something like that. You may find it's much more routine now that you're offering a self-assurance that you haven't offered in VCS.
Okay, yeah, good point.
Yeah, it's a good point, Jonathan. I wonder if we could, like you say, we could probably build a system that starts to churn fairly quickly. We'll consider it for piloting, I think. I just wanted to come to another question in the chat from Incy. I feel like I'm pronouncing your name wrong, so I apologize.
No problem. It's like Ingy.
Okay, right, thank you. So your question, unless you'd like to read it, was about the kind of baselines and aligning baselines with inventories. Do you want to ask that question, Angie?
Yeah, sure. What I'm thinking is, how do we determine the baseline? Because it would differ from sector to sector, from company to other companies. And, a lot of companies are already doing their GHG inventories and getting them verified. And I asked if, let's say, we will seek some kind of like joint registration and like verification under the Scope 3 program in 2026, and that we already have a 2025 verified baseline for the GHG inventory. Could we build our baseline assessment on top of that, or does it need to be reassessed by the Verra approved VBB?
Great question. Yeah, this is something we've been doing loads of work on recently with the methodology adaptation guidance. So I would say once that's released, obviously go and have a look at the work that we've done there. We've kind of tried to justify our proposals in that guidance too. But to answer your question, the baseline. The intent is to try and align the baseline with the company inventory, but as you say, that's really complex and difficult to do, and difficult to even get transparency into what these inventories are actually reporting, with all the different LCA approaches and the emission factors that are used. So we have decided that we're going to continue using the baseline as it's designed in in the VCS methodologies, at least for those methodologies that we're going to adapt from the VCS program. We're trying to include some safeguards and reasoning for why those baselines are appropriate, and also be transparent about what those baselines mean, and then also some guidance on how that would translate into what we would call integration. It's a term we borrowed from the VCI, but how you would take those impacts and integrate them into an inventory in a credible way, understanding that there's so much variation in these baselines and inventories. So yeah, so that's but I understand your question of like how could we actually just use the inventory as the baseline, but I think the reality is that it would be very difficult to go in and understand what the inventory actually, how it's being calculated, the data it uses, and so on.
Maybe if we can incorporate some kind of uncertainty rate for like different sectors, maybe that could be an idea to be conservative, of course.
Yeah, and Kai, feel free to jump in because you guys have done a lot of thinking about this as well at VCI.
Yeah, actually, so I mean, basically, the baseline is always depending on the project that you're preparing. So in the VCI, really, the baseline definition is either a historical one, or it's also could be a moving one, right? But it's always for the proponent to basically say what kind of baseline approach they wanna do, and then it's for the VBB to understand whether that is the appropriate, baseline methodology that is applied in a specific case. So yeah, there is some flexibility. So I don't think it needs to be necessarily clearly defined, as long as there's an understanding of what kind of baseline review is actually required. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, great. I'm going to just call on the raised hands, and then if we need some kind of more guidance to guide this conversation, we can go back to the questions too. But Alan?
Sure, thank you. Just picking up then on the questions raised, timescales leads me to think you're probably going to need to have some sort of variation in options here, because starting with an overall set of principles and then definitely looking at different applications for different subsectors, because those timescales are really long for transport. Transport is much more dynamic than that. Some companies absolutely die for a 6-month contract. So to have something set at 5 years really is not in the sort of timescale that they're looking at. We're looking at having to do retrospective annual verification. Validation looking forward doesn't really come into it. The expectation of the multinationals who are wanting these scope 3 reductions in their supply chain is, say, annual verification, reasonable assurance, self-attestation will just get laughed out, honestly. Okay. And their expectation is a level of accuracy such that there's no need for buffer. If it can't, okay. if it requires a buffer, then it's not good enough, basically, as a calculation and substitution.
Okay, so just to go back to your comment about timescales, so that 5-year issuing period is really just representing the 5 years of time that your intervention has been deemed by the VBB to the design to be, like it's designed per the program rules, it's following the methodology, we're estimating out what you'll likely achieve in 5 years, but then monitoring periods can be much more frequent than that, so that if you need to report annually, you have a monitoring period that's a year long and do that 5 times. Yeah, so does that clear, still sync up?
It comes into just a much more dynamic environment. I think 3 years max for the transport sector for that, honestly. And then with, as I say, you'd have to have annual verification with reasonable assurance within there. And I don't see that as being in any way forcing other sectors to follow the transport. I think you need to pick and choose what's appropriate for different sectors.
Right. So there's always the option of verifying to a reasonable level of assurance. So any intervention can do that. I want to go back to your comment about the 3 years. So what would be the benefit of having a 3-year crediting period versus having a 5-year? Like, would you like to see that validation be more frequent, or why is shorter issuing period better?
It's the dynamism of the market, the speed at which different solutions are coming to the market, being updated is so dynamic as IT systems are reaching this topic now, and the topic of digitization of supply chain for transport is so hot. That's why.
Okay, so maybe assumptions in the methodology and the quantification would change faster, more frequently than 5 years. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah,
They're probably, some of them are on a 6 to 12 month time scale at the moment.
Okay. All right. That's helpful for us to know. Thank you. I can't see.
I had a question also related to assurance. I think that what you presented here, meets what's expected of companies now more or less in their inventory and target setting, and in some cases exceeds. However, both SBTI and Greenhouse Gas Protocol are reviewing their assurance requirements. And so I think it'll be very worth following those processes as you go along in the next couple of years, because I imagine that it's not going to be the same. And it could be that by the time you reach the end of next year, I think as we've heard from others, you'll actually need the higher level of assurance, and companies won't be interested in limited assurance. I'll share in the link in the chat, just providing more information, at least on where SBTI is at on their review on assurance and MRV related issues. And I think similarly, a related comment on the buffer pool, or rather the overissuance buffer. It's so much not a part of the corporate inventory or target setting system now. I have a hard time envisioning how it could be integrated. And although I actually think it's been a very positive approach on the VCS side, I would want to think more about other options to reach necessary assurance levels here for the Scope 3 standard.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Just as background that I found interesting, the plastic program originally, I think it's launched currently with 2 assurance options, reasonable and limited, and they just haven't seen anyone take advantage of the limited assurance option. So I think that's kind of telling. So yeah, thanks for your comments. Meinrad?
Yeah, just coming back to the baseline discussion, and so you made reference to an upcoming guidance around that issue. Just curious about the timeline for that, and also because you refer to SBTI or progress against target, etc. So the extent to which consequential accounting will actually be allowed for by reporting frameworks is, I think, a key aspect you need to look at right now, because otherwise you're going to have to potentially revise accounting, and notably with respect to baseline. So just one note on this one, and maybe just with respect to timeline. Also, additionality, you mentioned additionality on several occasions. So, is it that additionality is indeed something that will be verified? So on the basis of additionality, the same way we understand it in the carbon market, or so that's one of the question. And final question about timeline again. I think I read this, you haven't presented this, but or referred to in the presentation, but I think somewhere in the paper it says 18 months for the issuance of the verification report. So 18 months within the end of the issuing period. Just wondering,
so that's for the random year verification, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the issuing period ends, and then you have like 18 months to perform that random year verification on the previous issuing period.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. And then just to go back to your first question about timeline for the method adaptation guidance, so that should be coming out next week. It basically walks you through all the sections of the VCS methodology and additional sections that we're proposing or thinking about adding for adapted methodologies. And there's like a whole section on baseline and a whole section on additionality outlining our thoughts and open questions. So we'll definitely send you all that document, but it should be in your hands by next week. And then you also had a question on additionality, yeah. And then I was going to let John take, but I think you had one more on the assurance design. I meant to write it down, but I only have a highlighter and no paper. So, anyone remember, or was there anything else I didn't cover? And I'll let another staff member take your. Okay, John or Candace or Abby, did you want to answer?
Did we cover? Yeah, did we cover Meinrad's question on additionality?
I don't think so. Okay,
Meinrad, would you mind just re-asking?
Do you expect additionality as being a required criteria in the context of Scope 3?
Yeah. Okay. Yes and no. So in our methodology adaptation guidance, we're going to propose that we maintain regulatory surplus additionality requirements, and then use some additionality, or potentially use some additionality tests or assessments to help bring projects up to that common practice baseline, where the baseline doesn't do that in its own design. I don't know if I communicated that very well, but basically we're going to try and apply some common practice additionality tests only where the baseline doesn't actually address or meet that common practice baseline situation. And the reason is that we are assuming that the emission factors that are used in inventories are effectively trying to describe the common practice, and so that therefore if we quantify our impacts relative to the common practice, that is a more credible impact to quantify, and then sort of use that in the inventory. I don't think I just explained that very well, but we do explain that in the methodology adaptation guidance, so I'd suggest that you have a look at that. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Meinrad. And if you think of something I didn't answer, I know you had a couple part questions, so if there's something I didn't get to, please just raise your hand again. Kai, go ahead.
Yep, thanks. Thank you, everyone. So basically, one of the things that I wanted to just add to you, Meinrad, for the additionality is also the jurisdiction, right, in the specific area where an intervention is occurring. So is there maybe a regulation that anyway says you have to, follow a specific procedure, or you have to already implement a part of the intervention? That would also change then, I guess, the question of additionality. So that's just one thing that I wanted to add. And then what I wanted to ask was about the timing again. So I wrote it also in the chat. It's just to understand if there is any validity period for the impact or intervention units. And why is that important? Because what I see from our experience is that often, it's not always aligned, right? You have the harvesting period, you have the reporting period, you have the annual verification cycles, and these things are not always perfectly aligning. And that's why I was wondering if for you, it's basically just always at the same time frame where these will be issued and then used. And also because most of the companies are doing their sustainability report just at the same time. So it creates this, what I would coin hunting season, where everybody is trying to gather all the information, does all the validation and verification of their projects. So yeah, I was just wondering if that was something you were thinking about in your design.
Mm-hmm. And that's specific to the right to report component? We're thinking more about claims made with the interventions units.
It's the claims, but it's also just the validation, takes time. And as I said, like the validation cycle, the harvesting cycle, the reporting cycles, the annual cycles, all these are not always necessarily overlapping, right? Or they have different time frames basically. So I was just wondering.
Yeah.
If that is something.
So I think we'll definitely have rules around like how. So we have a continuous monitoring requirement proposed, but there will probably likely need to be a rule where it's like you have to validate within X many years at the end of the first crediting issuing period. So in that way, I think that's answering sort of for the intervention implementation, the time period that they're operating within. When it comes to claims and validity period for right to report, that's a good point and an answer I don't have. I don't know if anyone else can weigh in, but it's definitely something we should consider.
You're asking kind of like what's the the vintage or how long a scope 3 intervention unit would be available for reporting? Is that, I capture that right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also always taking into consideration, the time it takes to do a verification or so you monitor all the year, then you do a verification and then it should still end up in the report, but the report is already out, right? So I mean, these kind of time frames.
Yeah, definitely. I think in an ideal world, it would the scope 3 intervention units would land in March of the reporting year, whenever corporates are submitting their CDP or GRI or SBT reports. But it is definitely something we have to think about because of all the complexity of all the things that you mentioned, how dynamic the system is. So yeah.
And some goods are also stored for longer, so they might be used by someone up the value, down the value chain, like at a different point in time. So I mean, these are just some consideration of timing.
I would think that would be a decision that would more come into version 2, the right to report.
The second.
Yeah, okay. Just checking.
Okay. I don't see any hands. There might be questions in the chat. So if you have one that hasn't been answered, feel free to raise your hand, or staff folk, let me know. But just oh, you got a hand, Meinrad? Yes. Oh, I think you're muted.
Small question about the self-attestation. Two questions. Because the intervention is enrolled in the certification process, but the year, there's no actual third-party verification. I cannot claim if I transfer the claim to customers downstream. I cannot claim these have been verified, right? So just wondering about the messaging or the perception out there about this, because it's a bit blurry, right? So that's one aspect. It's more about communication, I guess. But I mean, one aspect I wanted to raise, and the other one is, if in the context of self-attestation, are there any basic checks? For example, if I come to you and claim 3 times or 4 times what I claimed the year before with the same intervention, does it go through because it says I attest this is happening, or are there, do you plan any basic checks which would happen then within Verra and not by a third party, obviously?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so to the first question, can you call self-attestation and verification? No, you can't. So that's why originally we were playing around with the idea of like first-party verification, but we just felt like that introduced a lot of confusion between who's the verifier. So we've gone away from that language, and that's why we're calling this unit approval, not a verification. So units are approved and issued following a self-attestation, not a verification. So you definitely cannot claim that information was verified. And then as far as checks, we had at one point debated between having a limit. So based on the intervention description, when you're estimating your annual greenhouse gas ERRs, we had talked about maybe limiting the self-attestation amount of units that could be claimed to what you're estimating in your intervention description and what's validated by the BVB. But I think we ultimately went away from that idea because we plan on implementing kind of penalties if that random year verification turns up discrepancies in, like if you claim 300,000 scope 3 or intervention units, but you actually only achieved 50, and that comes out in your random year verification, then there would be penalties. So we think that the mix of penalties and companies caring about, not looking like they're greenwashing and reputational image kind of mitigates that risk of overclaiming. So I guess it's not checks or like limitations on what you can claim, but penalties if you're caught overclaiming.
Something that would be very useful, I think, when it comes to practical applications, is to have a standard language in templates that we could use as part of contracts or any transactions whenever they happen with downstream players in a chain, so that that this is actually has been thought through and is fairly standardized, and there's no misinterpretation.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. And also it'll be clear in the registry, like this unit was generated through self-attestation, or we'll think through the language, but it will be clear it's not verification. But I hear you on having some language prepared also would be helpful for you. So thanks for that comment.
Yeah, that's super important to us as well, right? Because of the risk. Our name is they're going to be listed on our registry, and self-attestation sort of new for us. So we would want to communicate that very transparently, that this is a self-attestation.
Yeah, definitely want to avoid greenwashing and confusion. Okay. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks. With respect to the overissuance buffer, you commented that these go into a pool. Would there be a way to claw back some of those IUs if a company verifies to reasonable assurance at a later date? And perhaps it's because I am perhaps differently from some of the rest of this group. I'm work mostly with industrial companies. I could envision where a company would be regularly self-reporting, as I mentioned before, for the purposes of generating cash flow out of those credit issuances, where then at a 1 or 2 year interval, they would want to go through the entire verification process. Is that something that you think is possible, potential here, given the structure?
Yeah, it's something we had talked about. I think in the current language we sent out in the brief, that's not an option. I think the tricky thing is that we typically would want to have rules where you can't go back and like re-verify a period and then claim more credits. But I hear what you're saying in terms of, increased assurance and then getting back buffer credits. So yeah, I think we'll look more into that. And yeah, I think we can discuss later and just kind of weigh the pros and cons, but it's a good point. Thank you. John?
Yeah, could I just jump in with a question for Jonathan? Jonathan, are you thinking along, like, what timescales are you thinking along? Are you thinking if you did kind of almost like monthly or quarterly self-attestations, and then at the end of the year, you wanted to claw back those units in the buffer through a reasonable level?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Yeah, because
okay.
we know that the verification resources, the VVBs that are out there, are already in too high of demand.
Right.
And while there's those professional services are scaling, the addition of new standards like this one are creating even more demand for those services. I think that where data collection analysis is fairly routine, like in the industrial sector, I'm not comparing this to agriculture, which is potentially a lot harder to being able to verify those those individual data points. I could see where they would do a large project, like I mentioned before, about point source capture or something like that, which is a exceedingly costly intervention. But in order to generate the sufficient cash flow that they're looking for off of that, they would want regular issuances of credits. I think they would be able to say, yeah, I'll take a 15% buffer aside now if I can true that up at the year ends, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think our default is always to think on multi-annual life cycles, just because that's how the VCS program works. So yeah, Yeah, interesting point. Yeah, we could think about that a bit more.
John, we had also like thought about that, and when it came to kind of the idea that maybe the self-attestation could be like a light touch that's like double checked later down the line, and that kind of sounds more like what Jonathan's describing. So maybe we could kind of bring back that thinking and see if that might be another option we could offer, or replace the self-attestation as sort of like a temporary option that will be replaced.
I know the people in low carbon steel would be very interested in it as well.
Yeah, digitization of our methodologies would help with that, right? Because that's one of the things that takes time, right? Is the all the kind of paperwork and more manual way of submitting documents and things. So yeah, that work's going on at Verra, is to digitize our methodologies, and hopefully that will coincide with the launch of this program.
Great. Well, I think we're kind of heading to the end of my time, but thank you all. If there's any other questions, I think we're going to send out maybe a survey, but if not, feel free to send us an email, and I'll, I think, hand it back off to John.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Yeah, thanks for the discussion. Maybe we do have, this is our last slide, so if there is anybody, I know there's a lot of questions in the chat. I don't know if we followed them all. Is there any questions in the chat that people asked that didn't get answered? We probably have time for one more. Not forever hold your peace. Or just reply to the survey. Okay. All right, we'll finish up there. So yeah, just some next steps. As Shay mentioned, we'll follow up with a survey to make sure we get all of your responses, and obviously give you a little bit of time to think about the discussion a little bit more too. Our next meeting is in May, May 1st and 2nd. Topic to be determined. I think it was maybe, I forget if it was Meinrad, somebody mentioned that May 1st and 2nd might be difficult for folks in Europe to attend due to a holiday. Maybe we could just have a very quick show of hands or something. Is that going to be a problem? If so, we could look to reschedule that meeting. Looking at the Europeans.
Do you want to make it a specific question?
You make it a poll. A poll will help, I think. Yes or no. We can vote.
Can you? Oh, can we do that?
I tried, but it's not my meeting, so I'm sorry.
I'm a real laggard with this kind of stuff.
I'm just seeing if I can sort it out. How about if it is an issue, raise your hand right now, and then we'll just count how many people it's an issue for. Does that work?
That's a good idea. Any hands?
Oh, Garrett. But we could also include this in the survey. Maybe,
yeah, we'll
John.
include it in the survey, maybe. Okay. Yeah, and then obviously we've got the two options, and this is just your list of the next meetings. We'll determine the topic for the next meeting and let you know nearer the time. If you have any suggestions on topics or any questions that you'd like us to cover that you think are priority questions, yeah, we're happy to take those suggestions as well. With that, I think we can wrap, and thank you for your time. Thank you for really engaging discussion. Again, lots for us to take home and think about. Yeah, I really appreciate all the engagement.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.